I spend a lot of time talking with Anthropic and NVIDIA, and even they'll tell you like, oh, we feel like we got to go faster, right? And even they would acknowledge that it's actually too much, right? The pace of delivery and output and innovation is almost too much. But even the ones who are furthest ahead probably think that they have to keep up that velocity.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the season 2 of the Founders Code, called The AI Floor. This is the show where we skip the hype and try to find the real ground level of where AI actually is right now. And I could not have picked a better guest to open with. So, please welcome Larry Jin.
Just the sheer amount of economic value that's lost away in what is effectively a digital filing cabinet of PDFs, right? I mean, every company has got a SharePoint repository or a network storage folder with thousands, or even often the case, hundreds of thousands of these contracts that are like dozens of pages. And, you would hire big teams of data scientists and ML engineers to go do those things, right? And then overnight, ChatGPT comes around and you're like, wait a second, this will get you 85% of the way there with absolutely zero pre-training, zero specialized training. I think about the mathematical sort of calculus for whether someone does something is like, what's the benefit I'm going to get? What's the effort I have versus the effort I have to put in versus the risk of it going wrong, right? And it has to balance out. There's an innovation frontier that's moving at 120 miles an hour. And then there's the tail edge of that is moving at like 5 miles an hour, because those are your biggest, most entrenched, typically most regulated industry verticals. But that's where most of the real world lives. You're on the bleeding edge and you forget you're very much in a bubble, right?
Welcome to the AI Floor. My guest today helps lead product at DocuSign, a company most people still file under his signature, but that label is about 3 years out of date. DocuSign has just named one of the Fast Company's most innovative companies of 2026, sitting right alongside companies like Google and NVIDIA for turning itself from a product into a platform, an intelligence layer underneath the world's agreements. And the person driving a lot of that future, sharpened his craft at Amazon and at Microsoft before this. He now runs the part of DocuSign that is pushing it into the age of AI agents. So, without further ado, please welcome Larry Jin. Hi Larry, welcome to the show.
Hey Shamil, thanks for having me.
To start with, can you talk us a bit through your personal journey that kind of led to where you are right now?
Sure. Yeah. And thanks again for the glowing introduction. I think I got some goosebumps just listening to that. Well, I've been in product management for close to 15 years. Started off with a software engineering background. So it's very technical by nature, and, learned the ins and outs of not just how to use things, but why things work the way they work. Some of my fondest memories in college, or university as we call it in Canada, but we're studying compilers and operating systems, distributed systems, and it's great as you build some of that foundation. So I took that and did software engineering for a while before getting into PM, and then joined out of school, went to Microsoft as my first gig, was there for about 7 years and worked on really all the really cool parts of Microsoft, Windows, Xbox, Skype, consumer, and then eventually went on to be one of the early product members of what became Microsoft Teams. This was, I think, four different names. It started off at all these internal names, and then eventually became Microsoft Teams, and was there for the preview, for the GA. That was a lot of fun. And then went to Amazon, spent a couple of years at Alexa, where I worked on Alexa bringing, conversational speech features for listening to music and radio and, even podcast, just like the one that we're on here, before joining DocuSign about 5 years ago, where I came in and now I lead product management for our platform area that includes many of our integrations, our workflow capabilities, our enterprise products. So just really excited to see the evolution of many things, of software, enterprise software, AI, conversational AI. And then even, I know this is kind of meta, but even seeing the evolution of the product management craft, which, I'm sure we can have another session dedicated to that at another time.
Yeah. That's awesome. Do you think that technical upbringing, let's say, has helped you kind of combine the business kind of aspect of understanding the company, the business requirements, and also the technology underneath to be able to manage all of those products.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think product is unique in that it's very diverse in terms of the different ways that people get into it. I've worked with PMs who have marketing, finance, business. My old manager, I think, studied biology as his undergrad, right? It's very diverse, but I do think having a strong, CS or software engineering background helps you because I think it particularly early on in your career, it helps you get a little more sort of early credibility working with devs in particular who expect you
Yeah.
to be able to go deeper on, the how, certain constraints, why certain features are easier to build than others. And I think it makes it a little bit easier. But as I said, a lot of great PMs start off with completely non-technical backgrounds.
And it's going to be a good topic for us to even mention within this podcast, because I think the common thread around like different companies, as I've been speaking to different departments and different industries, is like everybody's now becoming a product manager, whether that's a head of legal ops, whether that's head of procurement. Everyone has to start thinking about technology and get accustomed to kind of understanding how do
Mm-hmm.
like AI tools work, like what are the LLM layers, like the RAG and everything, to make sure that they can automate a big part of their work as well. So I guess it kind of helps you to both look at the products that are developed, for example, by DocuSign right now for the clients, as well as managing things internally to optimize for efficiency.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. It's interesting. I just gave a talk a couple of weeks ago for our entire HR organization. So we have, I think a global team of a couple hundred that's
Mhm.
HR business partners, talent acquisition, skill development, all these teams that basically support our global workforce at DocuSign. And the entire session was about how our HR team can really reimagine how they work now with AI and being less of doing grunt work and more of, like you said, using AI to effectively become product manager. So the whole session was basically how to think like a product manager, but within an HR function. And so really thinking about what are the problems that you need to solve? Who is your customer, right? Now, in HR's case, their customer is internal employees, right?
Yeah.
Or candidates looking for a potential opportunity at DocuSign. How do you think about their needs and their pain points as a customer persona, and then using AI to build tools and solutions? It's a very different way of working than in a traditional, more operational focused role where you're just trying to do your sort of day-to-day tasks. But now, like you said, with AI, you have to kind of take a step back and it's more meta. Like,
Yeah.
what are the business processes that you can better automate? What are the pain points inside of the organization? So I think to your point, there's something there that, people within the human capital within these organizations is going to be deployed on a different set of problems than historically.
And I think companies like the leading AI companies that we have right now, like NVIDIA, Anthropic, OpenAI, they've been putting a lot of noise out there in terms of marketing, in terms of like AI is going to be the only technology present in the company, is going to replace everyone. We're not going to have employees' jobs. And in terms, of course, they need to raise their share prices and make their technology seem like the AGI kind of is already here. But at the same time, they're really creating a situation where there are companies that try to get their employees to adopt AI, but everyone's really scared of AI because of the
Right.
general notion of like what is out there, what those companies have advertised. How do you help,
Mhm.
drive that engagement and build the trust with people like that? It's just a tool to increase your efficiency.
Yeah. In terms of you're saying like in terms of creating adoption internally inside the
Yeah.
organization. Yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about our own journey and, where product organization, engineering, and how each one has kind of approached it differently. I would say there's kind of two buckets, right? There's general company-wide productivity AI tools that are job or function independent, right? So we use things like Glean, obviously Gemini, and these tools that I think the way that you earn trust is you really have to just show, two things. One is it's a very natural extension of the way that you already work, right? So Gemini is a good example. How do you build trust with Gemini? Well, it's really not that much of a leap for someone who is writing an email or working on a doc to have a little, the little glimmer icon that suggests, hey, let me suggest how to tighten up this paragraph, gives you a suggestion, but ultimately the human is in control of whether they want to insert that or not, right? Even just earlier today, I was using that to prepare a document, and it's kind of interesting. I think this is a new experience. This must be a new feature, but the way Gemini does it, it's almost like if you put your document into Word editing, into suggestion mode or track changes, and someone makes edits to it, and it shows you all the different suggestions, and you can choose to accept or reject them individually. And so Gemini started doing that, right? But the point is that ultimately you're in control. So I think that's one is start with kind of low risk, but highly valuable, highly repeatable things that are already naturally in the flow of the things that you already do. And I think that's why, Gemini has been very easy to adopt. Glean also has been easy to adopt because it's been such a powerful search tool and being able to bring together different enterprise sources like documents, Slack conversations, emails, even, your CRM information, which has been really, really powerful. Then so that's the first bucket is general purpose kind of department, job title agnostic, right? The second bucket is more function specific, right? So obviously within engineering, you have tools that help you accelerate software development tasks, whether that's coding, testing, deployment, monitoring, CI/CD, DevOps sort of type things. Within product, there are emerging specialized tools. Similarly, within marketing and sales functions, sales, I mean, incredible explosion of productivity tools to help with, prospecting and better understanding and qualifying leads, preparing you for the upcoming sales call you're going to have with a prospective client. And then, legal as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is just a huge explosion in legal tech tools to help with drafting and deep legal research and legal matter management. And so, the second part of it is really looking at these, job specific AI tools. And again, same methodology applies where you can't just roll something out brand new and say, change everything about the way you're working and expect it to be successful. You have to find these incremental paths to value, right? And with engineering, there's a reason why Claude has been so incredibly successful in taking off within organizations starting from coding, because it was so natural to go from, hey, I have an IDE where I write my code, to now that IDE is supercharged with being able to auto-generate code for functions and classes and entire libraries and packages. And so very, very natural sort of extension of what you're already doing in the flow of work. If you're asking people to change your behavior, right? So, I think about the mathematical sort of calculus for whether someone does something is like, what's the benefit I'm going to get? What's the effort I have versus the effort I have to put in versus the risk of it going wrong, right? And it has to balance out. And I think where the tools have been really successful is the value is clear and evident in terms of time savings or efficiency. The risk is relatively low, right? Especially with tools where ultimately I get a choice as a human whether I want to accept the AI suggestion or not, right? So the risk is relatively low. If I don't like it, well, worst case is I just reject the change.
Unless you go and bypass permissions.
Right. Well, that's where, things that are doing things on your behalf, that's a much bigger leap, right? Which I'm sure we'll talk about with agents, but you have to build up towards that. You can't just kind of go there automatically, right? And so, there's value, there's risk, and then of course there's the effort, which is if I have to change my behavior, I have to learn something new. That's just a much bigger lift than doing something that is already in the flow of the tools that are already used, whether it's Slack or Google Calendar, or Gmail, Teams, Word, whatever it is.
I love it. So basically take the tools that everybody's already using and help them implement AI tools that will operate and enhance their current experience to kind of get their feet wet and start trusting the tools out there, the technology. And let's unpack this, right? The DocuSign case is very exciting for me because it shows how even the largest of the companies can take the newly discovered, let's say, technology that AI and LLMs are and make such a huge pivot. And DocuSign made a big bet into becoming a infrastructure for the future that companies are going to build around AI as that trust layer, which is the agreements that you sign, which is the most basic kind of element, right? Can you talk us a little bit about that transition, about the decision to make a transition from a signature and CLM into intelligent agreement management?
Yeah. It wasn't so much a light bulb moment like, oh my gosh, we should be doing this. Let's stop everything and let's go do it. It was really a natural progression of the company and the journey that we've been going through for years now, right? Like you said, everybody knows DocuSign for e-signature. It's super, there are a few companies, particularly software technology companies in the world that are so well known, trusted, ubiquitous. Very few people that I've talked to, if they know the DocSign brand at all, it's because they've signed something with it, right? They bought a
Yeah.
car, they opened an account, they, leased an apartment. It's just kind of this, one of the few brands, again, especially in technology, that just has that trust and reputation behind it. But I would say for almost 10 years, have seen this bigger opportunity of going deeper into this problem space of helping customers get more value out of agreements, right? Whether that's helping them make it easier to create and sort of generate and negotiate and all the stuff that happens before signature. I mean, when you deal with like really complicated contracts, particularly between two business organizations. So
Hmm.
imagine you're like deciding, acquiring another company, Walmart acquiring a smaller organization. I mean, the amount of contracting and papering and legal back and forth negotiation, it is really, really complex. And I think there's just huge opportunities to streamline that, both for the low volume or low frequency stuff where value is really high for each individual agreement, but even for the higher volume and lower sort of value for each individual contract. I think there's pretty wide spectrum, and it's a universal problem, right? And so that's one piece. The second is, of course, everything that happens after you sign an agreement. I mean, just the sheer amount of economic value that's lost away in what is effectively a digital filing cabinet of PDFs, right? I mean, every company has got a SharePoint repository or a network storage folder with thousands, or even often the case, hundreds of thousands of these contracts that are like dozens of pages. And anytime a question comes up, it's like, well, I guess we have to ask poor, Larry Legal to go and, first you have to like send them an email, ask them to do this, then they have to create a task in their queue. And then it takes them 2 business weeks to get back to you, because they often have to, let's take an example, like a new regulation that comes up in Germany that says you have to change your CO2 emissions target. I don't know, making something up, right? And you're a company that is in manufacturing or agriculture, right? Or any number of these companies that actually have material impact on carbon emissions. When you go back to your contracts and try to understand, what does this mean for us in terms of
Hmm.
liabilities and obligations to our customers, to regulators, to partners, um, to suppliers and vendors. And it is really, really complicated. I mean, it's literally legal
Yeah.
teams have to manually go through, mountains and mountains of data, find the documents, open them up, and, control F. And even sometimes that doesn't work because the word that you're looking for may not be in the contract. It may be more of a semantic search. So all of these things that have just always been really hard. And what's interesting is that most customers kind of just accepted that it sucked. They're like, "What? This is just this is the way that it's
Normal
done."
way.
And
Mm.
yeah, this is just the way that it's done. And it's like, I don't know, buying a concert ticket and realizing that you have to pay 50% in extra fees. You're like, I guess this is just the way it works. I'll accept it. And you either hire more in-house attorneys or you outsource to external legal firms to do a lot of this work. And I think what's incredible is that, this problem existed for a long time. And it wasn't until LLMs came along that your ability to really reason over this in a deep and meaningful way, right? Because traditional machine learning techniques were applied to contract understanding for years, right? You would develop specialized models and train them on corpuses of contracts so that you could, get pretty good at being able to pick out, oh yeah, this is a contract for a master services agreement. These are the key dates, like limit of liability, total contract value. Here's the
Yeah.
expiration date. Here's the delivery date. And you would hire big teams of data scientists and ML engineers to go do those things, right?
Yeah.
And then overnight, ChatGPT comes around, and you're like, wait a second, this will get you 85% of the way there with absolutely zero pre-training, zero specialized training. And so I think it has really opened up people's eyes about what you can do here and highlighted a problem that I think many people just assumed, well, that's just the way it works. We have to do it manually. And I'll give you another analogy on this. And I've been thinking a lot about this since my time at Alexa. So when I was at Amazon working on Alexa, this was between 2019 and 2021. And, it was this dominant platform in the ecosystem when it came to voice speakers and smart home
Yeah.
devices, right? I mean, it was either that or Google. Those are the only two games in town. And what's interesting is that the devices were there, the distribution was there, the use cases were there, the AI wasn't there.
Yeah.
And so it had everything going for it except the actual intelligence, because of state of the art of the technology wasn't there. And you fast forward a few years and now it's like the AI is caught up, right? And so sometimes it's just the problem is there, the need is there, but it may be latent because the state of the art of the technology just hasn't been able to fulfill on the customer need and promise. And I think with contracts, we're getting to a point where, there's a reason if you look at the announcements, marketing, PR, a lot of the examples from, Anthropic and OpenAI, or even other players in the ecosystem, like, they always kind of focus on understanding contracts as one of the first initial use cases. I think because one, they finally show the technology can do a really great job. And two, it is a universal need.
Yeah. And another thing is, like, when thinking about this topic of agreements, usually let's take an example of, like, right, 100,000 agreements. You have that in your database, and you go to your ChatGPT and you give it access. And you're like, okay, find me these companies, all of these companies' agreements. The amount of work ChatGPT needs to do, the amount of tokens it needs to burn to go through all of the contracts, do fuzzy matching on a name to make sure that there are different variations spelled in different documents, pull out the relevant ones. Like, sometimes there can be like 20, 30 pages in them, analyze all of them and come back to you with the research. And you already spent, I don't know, like $200 just checking whether the company has, like, what's the history's been like. And that's something that DocuSign has been fixing, right? With the current agreement manager. And that is fascinating to me because that really helps save the tokens. And I believe that the future, after we kind of get okay with using AI for everything, we're going to be thinking, okay, how do we minimize the token usage? Because that's going to be the driving kind of expense for the companies. And I think what you're doing with an agreement manager is going to help solve that. So can you talk a bit about maybe DocuSign Iris and the agreement manager?
Yeah, so let's give a quick overview of both kind of capabilities. So, DocuSign, we launched a new platform called Intelligent Agreement Management a couple of years ago. And really a core foundation of that was using AI to understand what's in contracts and to create structured representations and data models around them out of the box with minimal amount of customization, right? So the idea is I can take my 100,000 agreements, like we said, maybe they're in a folder somewhere, maybe there were ones that were already e-signed using DocuSign e-signature, and to be able to put them into the centralized repository and then create the structured data representation around them. And that second part is it's done using Iris, which is the name of our the marketing name for our proprietary AI engine that obviously uses also LLM capabilities as well, just like everyone's doing, but it also uses other proprietary techniques. And so you raise a really important point, which is if you have one agreement, one contract, and you need to be able to process it, summarize it, pull out key information, ask questions about it, you could certainly upload that into ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, name your AI tool of choice, right? It'll do a really good job of that, right? And it'll remember a little bit of that context. So in the future, I've recently been using that actually for some real estate transactions. It's just super convenient as a consumer to be able to do those things. But it's really different when you're a business organization and you have, anywhere, I would say, getting into the order of hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, because these are documents that once they're signed, they don't really change, right? In fact, they shouldn't change because they're contracts, right? So what's on them, the words, the clauses, the key terms and dates and values, the metadata about who signed them, timestamps, all of that, is static, right? This is a static memorialization of what was agreed. And so it's really inefficient to every time you have to ask a question about your contracts to have to re-ingest and reprocess 10,000, right? And so I think that with and this is, I think, going to be true of any enterprise data set that is large enough, it ends up becoming more, how do you intelligently ingest, process it? You're still using the latest and greatest AI capabilities, but you're doing so in an optimized way that is optimized both for the accuracy based on the information that you care most about. Because for contracts, it turns out people kind of look for the same things over and over again, right? I mean, if you take, let's say, a supplier contract, right? Let's say that you are a company that buys from hardware, manufacturers that make widgets. You buy stuff from software companies. You buy stuff from SaaS companies, AWS, Azure. You buy from Staples because they give you office supplies and pens and staplers, right? As it turns out, you typically ask for the same questions over and over again, which is, okay, let's say we have a renewal coming up with AWS for another year of kind of fixed cloud commitment. I know you can go month pay as you go, but a lot of large organizations typically have upfront multi-year commitments. So you're negotiating renewal. You'll ask, well, what did we sign for the last 3 years? How much did we commit to spend? How much did we actually spend, right? How much are we spending on them relative to other similar vendors, right? And when you get to really big organizations, it turns out that if you look at a category of software spend, there isn't just one of them inside the company. There could be multiple. So, procurement specialists or operations people or the head of finance or accounting might ask, how much are we spending on this particular category? Or, hey, Bob's cost center over there for tax auditing, they seem to be spending a lot of money on this particular software. How much are they spending overall? And so, you have these questions about your contracts, what's in them, both on an individual level, but also kind of at an aggregate level over many, many contracts. And so you want your AI to be really optimized to be able to help answer these types of questions, but also in a cost-efficient, performant way. So that often means I don't want to have to do this over and over again from an AI processing standpoint. Like you said, that would just be cost prohibitive in terms of tokens. No, you want to do that in an optimized way once. You want to pull out all the extractions. You want to build your vector index database, and then you want to be able to query that going forward. So these are the kinds of techniques that I think people assume that, well, if I just throw all this into an LLM, like it'll do it. Well, yes, it'll do it. It may cost you 1,000x what you wanted to. It may also take 1,000 times longer than you wanted to, and you're going to have to do it every single time, versus these sort of techniques that only when you really understand the domain of the problems that you're trying to solve with that data set can you then sort of create these optimized techniques for. And oftentimes it's just how you ingest, how you pre-process, how you ingest, how you process, and then how do you store those in sort of the right manner.
And then for an average department, also trying to just figure out what are vector databases and how to use them.
Well, yeah,
it's already going to take weeks.
I mean, nowadays, of course, you could vibe code your own solution for that within the finance department. But, do you really want your finance department to build their own version of that and vibe code that? And then your sales department and then your marketing folks and your operations and procurement folks. It's, at some point, everyone is just building basically a software platform that you really should just have someone do that for you. I mean, especially if that's not your core competency, right?
And I really like that you're giving examples from real industries, because a lot of the listeners for this season are going to be leaders in different departments within all of the industries out there. And I think it will be interesting to kind of go industry by industry to see what is the major play that DocuSign is planning for those industries. Like the big one, obviously, I think we can start with legal, because a lot of DocuSign's users are like heavy legal people. And there's been a lot of news out there with DocuSign partnering with both Harvey and Legora. What has been the main play with these partnerships?
Yeah, it's a great question. Very timely one. I'll say a few things. One is legal as a departmental. So legal is kind of overloaded. So I'll be a little bit more specific. So when we think about legal, there's typically two kind of big buckets of legal groups that you could serve as someone who's building software, building, let's say you're a startup, you're building a new solution. You're like, I really want to get into legal tech. One of the first things you have to decide is, who am I building this for? Is it for in-house legal? So these are legal teams that reside within organizations. So within DocuSign, we, have a chief legal officer, and he has a team of lawyers who focus on commercial contracting activities, IP, patent, laws, and sort of protecting our IP. We have legal teams who are focused on compliance and risk management. And so that is generally a function that exists in most business organizations. If you're small, you probably have one, up to Fortune 500s who probably have, departments with thousands of lawyers, right?
Yeah.
And then there's outside law firms, ranging from the small, like, billboards that you see on the side of the road. It's like personal injury. If you get in a car accident, call
Better Call Saul.
Jim and Bob, Better Call Saul. There you go. Exactly. And you roll up to their office and he's got like the giant inflatable balloon. So, there's that, all the way up to, of course, the most reputable, law firms that deal with commercial law, that provide legal services, outside counsel, but also do a lot of BPO, business process outsourcing. So they may help outsource some of the legal tasks, and the big firms like EY, Ernst and Young and Deloitte do that kind of thing as well. And so for us, we're really focused on the first, which is, how do we help in-house legal teams get more efficient? And the reason why is because they're often the ones that have to touch the contracts inside of an organization. And these are contracts of all types, right? If you have a, let's say you're selling SaaS to other companies, every contract that you sign is a commercial agreement, right? That says, we're going to sell you this many seats or this many tokens over this period of months. Here's how much you're going to pay us. Here's, when you're going to pay us, either 30 days after the start of the month or 45 days, whatever it is, right? So those are commercial contracting activities. Similarly, you have contracts that you take in from buying from others, right? Your procurement department, you're going to buy software and pens and widgets and real estate space, right? It's a very diverse set of spending activities. And then you have employee agreements. You have HR contracts that govern your relationship with your own workers. That could be simple, could also be very, very complex, depending on the states and countries and different jurisdictions and labor regulations therein. And so, we've always, and I would say with IAM, been very focused on helping those users get really, really efficient with a lot of the legal tasks. One example is just reviewing commercial contracts. How do I make sure that this contract we're about to sign with another business entity doesn't violate our internal posture? Like, how do we make sure that it doesn't violate our playbooks? There's a whole concept of legal playbooks, and making sure that the legal team is looking out for the best interest of the company, and that you're not, by signing a contract, opening yourself up to future liability and risk and litigation, right? So that's a lot of what we do. Now, I'll turn to the legal tech space in general. There is, like you said, so many different companies and startups and really, really cool technologies that have come on the scene, again, largely because of the advent of LLMs. Because ultimately you get down to, what is contracts? It is words on a document that both parties agree to. And words have been really, really, really hard for a long time for computers to understand in a natural language way, right? Until LLMs came along. So it's kind of like the domain of contracts is a perfect killer use case fit for modern AI and LLMs, right? And I think that's where we've seen this explosion of early venture activity, startups, but also established companies who are kind of entering in this with new product offerings. Like Thomson Reuters has a product called CoCounsel. Microsoft recently announced a legal word plugin, a word assistant. So we're seeing this because clearly the need is there in the industry, and it's always been there. Like we said earlier, it was just kind of latent, and the tools were not well served. And now we're seeing, because of the technology, it's just increasingly easy to kind of build a solution to be able to do things at a basic level. Now, I promise I would answer your question of, what are we doing together with these companies? IAM as a platform is not meant to provide every possible tool out of the box for every user of every contract type, right? And so when you think about really successful platforms, and whether it's Salesforce or Azure, right? They provide a basic set of capabilities. They provide scaffolding. They provide the reach and distribution, and they provide access to data. But it's ultimately by partnering and integrating with many, many specialized tools that you're able to offer a better joint solution into the market. And so when we work with Harvey, when we announced that a few weeks ago, really the idea there is DocuSign has a really good understanding of what's in your contracts because we have all those optimized techniques for extractions and storage and semantic representation of your agreement structure, all the stuff that we just talked about. Harvey has a really compelling set of tools to help legal personas be much more productive in terms of drafting, in terms of doing deep research, right? And so one of the really cool use cases is that what you can do is, let's say you're asked to review all of the contracts with a particular supplier over the past 10 years inside of your firm. What we can do is you can pull up all of those contracts and all of the important attributes and metadata using DocuSign, using Iris. But then inside of Harvey, you can also use all of their additional legal research tools that allow you to cross-reference that with prior case law or different regulatory statutes in different jurisdictions. And now you can marry those two and create just a much better understanding of what's in your contracts and what you've committed to, but then assess the liability and the risk profile based on case law and other frameworks, right, from the outside world. So in case you can't tell, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm far from being able to speak about this eloquently. But again, the reason why the IAM platform is so compelling is that by building the right platform, you can bring in specialization through these partnerships and these integrations. And that's exactly what we announced with Harvey, but also with other providers like Legora as well.
And it's interesting, like when you were talking about legal and then HR, like within my company, I also noticed that legal and HR work a lot. Like legal and procurement, they also work a lot. And then when I start thinking about what DocuSign is currently releasing as a platform, they're almost becoming like the platform which can come into the company, like in Microsoft, right? And then you have all these different like apps within different departments that you can use that kind of come together as one. So in this case, I'm also seeing that DocuSign is releasing hubs for different other areas of the company. So to make sure that it's not just the legal department that's using DocuSign, it's now a tool that can be used by all of the departments as almost like a data infrastructure layer. How are you tackling that? Because there is just so many different use cases within every single vertical.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. That is the opportunity. Like there's just so many different like kind of variations of the workflow, but you can't go after all of them at once. So the way that we've been thinking about it is within an organization where contracts shows up is typically in, roughly four different high level areas or functions, right? One is sales. So that's commercial contracts. So, you're selling software, widgets, AI tokens, or whatever to another company. Typically, that means you're going to create a services contract, you're going to create an MSA, you're going to create a quote. All of these are contracts that ultimately are going to be signed by you as a seller, signed by the customer as the buyer, right? So that's one sort of bucket. The second, like you said, is procurement, which is I got to buy widgets and pens and lease real estate facilities and hire outside services. And so there is a corpus of these vendor agreements or supplier agreements within an organization. The third is, like I said, HR contracts, right? Employees and governing the relationship and the obligations to your employee, but also your employee back to you. And also, it's really complicated, a bit of a tangent, but you look at, for example, we operate in Europe, right? And in Europe, every country has a very exacting set of local labor laws around notice periods and what the laws that say you can't reach out to a worker off hours. Like you're literally not allowed to send them emails and Slacks and
so
if they're not core working hours. Yeah. And so these are really, really complex things. And so, and then the fourth one is your relationship with partners as well. So, other organizations that you may be selling with, right? And so you kind of look at these high-level buckets, and what we try to do is create these workflows for those specific lines of business, departments, use cases. Those are all, we kind of use that terminology interchangeably. So for sales, for example, you kind of have to look at what is a quintessential sales workflow for contracting that 90% of sales workflows kind of sort of looks like. And typically it's like, well, a salesperson, they usually live and breathe inside their CRM, right? So they'll be in Salesforce, they're looking at an opportunity and they say, hey, Shamil is the CEO of this company, and I think, I want to send him a quote because I think he's interested in my new podcasting software, right? And so I'm going to go in Salesforce, I'm going to generate a quote, I'm going to send it over to you, and then you're going to say, hey, this is great, but I want to negotiate a little bit. You may also have your own terms for saying, I have very specific payment requirements or accounting requirements, or I don't like these clauses that you have in your contract that says I have to agree to being a reference, public PR reference for your software. I don't like any of this stuff. So that's the negotiation, right, between organizations. And so, being able to capture those negotiations, which often includes the salesperson involved in it, but it could also include other functions like legal and finance and others involved. And then eventually you get to the part where everybody actually enjoys, which is signing on the dotted line, right? Shamil finally said yes, he's going to buy the podcasting software. Sparks go off, fireworks, great. And then after that, how do you actually find that contract that Shamil signed for buying the podcasting software? And how much was he quoted? What were the discounts? How many seats did he buy? So all this information. And so what we do is we look at this workflow and say, okay, 90% of the time, it kind of needs these steps, these pieces. These are the people that use them. And then to your earlier point, you sort of design the workflow and the tools around that. And so some of that is going to be UI that we create. A lot of that is just UI that we actually put into Salesforce itself, right? And so that's the other big element of this is based on the type of workflow, it may be less about us having a UI that everyone comes to, like a hub, and maybe it's more about plugging into someone else's hub because that's where people work, right? Salespeople typically work in only like CRM and email, Slack, right?
And how do you make those decisions?
Text message. Which ones?
There's like implementing that within the overall DocuSign infrastructure and going in and choosing the platforms to integrate with.
Yeah, I think it starts with just understanding kind of the day in the life of and how do people work, right? How do people work? And kind of going back to one of the earlier things I said when we were talking about AI adoption, change is really hard. People don't like to change their behaviors, right? Again, I was joking, but if I was to truly sell you on a new podcasting tool that's not the one that you're currently using, you'd be like, I got to learn a new thing. The DocuSign podcasting tool. It's going to be the best tool ever for podcast. You'd be like, I got to learn a new thing. Now you got to change behaviors, right? You have probably a workflow and you're used to a UI, you're used to certain layouts, right? And so same thing with people in every single job function. I mean, you try to convince a legal person, for example, that they should use Google Docs instead of Microsoft Word, and be like, no way, right? Or an accounting person trying to convince them to do their accounting outside of spreadsheets. It's probably not going to happen. So you understand what is their behavior, how do they like to work, and we try to adapt. And I think this is the beauty of where technology is going with AI, is much more adapting the tool to the person and not creating a tool and asking people to change their behavior and use it, right? And I think that's kind of the age and the era that we're in now.
Yeah. And can you tell me a bit about the actual agentic piece? Because on DocuSign Momentum 26, just a couple of weeks ago, you've had a big announcement about introducing DocuSign Agents. Can you tell us about the current vision for those agents that you have?
Yeah, I think it just like kind of the mirroring how the industry is moving from where were we 10 years ago is like turn by turn chatbots where you had a very, very specific conversational. I know this because I worked on chatbots 10 years ago. We were trying to do this. And when chatbots were a big thing the first time around, well, maybe not even the first time. I'm sure the first time around, it was probably in the 80s. But the last time chatbots were a really big deal in the mid 2010s. And it was like everybody like Facebook Messenger and everybody to want to be like WeChat. And everyone was creating chatbots and chatbot frameworks. But it was they all had the same issue, which is like very rigid conversational dialogues. And like everybody's demo was, like here's how you order a pizza with like 27 steps. And then you get to step 23, you'd say the wrong thing, and the entire conversation would break, and you'd have to go all the way back to the beginning and be like, I want a large pizza with 3 toppings on it, right? So that was like, that was like the baby step, right? But it proved that there was something. And I think it's the reason why we keep coming back to this modality is because people talk, right? We communicate. That is our preferred way of interacting. You and I prefer to communicate by talking, not by me drawing a picture on a piece of paper and then handing you that piece of paper and you figuring out what I drew, right?
That would have been a fun podcast, but yeah.
That would have been a really fun podcast. You should do that next time. We'll need more than an hour. But it's the same thing with talking to computers and tools and software, right? People prefer to talk to it. And so again, LLMs came along, and now all of a sudden it was just infinitely better at being able to actually carry on a multi-turn conversation across an unbounded number of domains, knowledge domains, right? And then agents came, the notion of agents. And it was a natural extension, which is rather than just give me a response as a piece of text, why don't you go do something on my behalf, right? And do something, the difference between doing something and saying something, at least in software, is one is just a piece of text and the other is a structured request or an API call or an RPC invocation to some other system, right? But ultimately, LLMs are really good at doing both, right? If it needs to respond to you with text, it can do that. If it needs to respond by invoking a Google Maps API to go look up a location, it's really good at that too, because that request is just an HTTP web request with JSON under the covers. And so I think this is just a very natural extension of LLMs and what they can do, conversational chat. And so what we're trying to do from a DocuSign perspective is to say, okay, users don't just want to talk to their contracts, right? I mean, it's very, very powerful to be able to ask questions like, how much did I spend with this supplier over the last 3 years? Or, hey, summarize this really complicated lease agreement. I'm buying a house. So you get this 30-page seller disclosure. And you're like, I don't know what 90% of these words mean. Just tell me what I need to know. Here are these things that I'm worried about: easements, closing dates, earnest money. Tell me what I need to know, right? And they're really good at that. But I think the beauty is that you can do so much more than just ask questions and talk to your contracts. It's, well, what do I need to actually do with this information? Do I need to initiate a renewal? Because maybe this contract says, hey, it's going to auto renew it or auto expire in the next 3 months. You might want to get ahead of this. Well, how do I actually do a renewal activity? Well, I have to create a request from my legal team. I have to attach the previous version of that contract. I have to generate a new version of that contract using the latest terms as a proposal. And then I have to make sure it's assigned to the right person in legal so that they know that they have to review this. And then once all that's done, it needs to be sent over as a document for e-signature and then stored and captured. So, what you're essentially doing is you're taking what used to be many, many, many different steps that someone had to do manually, and you're able to describe it using natural language and say, this is the process I want to follow. And that's effectively what an agent is. You are describing a way to reason about something with context. You're describing the steps that it should take, the considerations and guardrails, and then you're describing the different tools that it can invoke, right? And some of those tools can be inside of DocuSign. Many of those tools are outside of DocuSign. So, one of those tools might be get some information from your CRM or update something inside of your ERP system, right? And so that is effectively, if you look at the anatomy of an agent, and different companies call them differently. Some of them will call them skills or plugins. I think Claude calls them their stuff more plugins, but they're all kind of sort of in the same general ballpark.
Yeah. And what role do you think that will play in terms of unlocking more engagement and adoption with the currently? Because the range of tools you guys are pushing into the market is huge. You're trying to create value for every single function out there. And agentic, like agents, that's been on top of mind for a lot of people, like over the last year. What was it that bringing that agentic into those processes has unlocked for you as a company?
I would say the biggest thing is it's a much more organic way for our users to work, right? So let me give you kind of an analogy here. So in this space, which, maybe like 5% of the listeners will actually know about, but there is a software category called CLM, Contract Lifecycle Management. It's, been around for probably almost just as long as e-signature, maybe 15 years, yeah, or so. And CLM, there's a number of vendors in the space. You can do a quick Google search, and there's all these different companies. DocuSign is, of course, one of them. We're actually the leader in CLM, but there's several others as well. And CLM was kind of an attempt, the old school way of solving many of the problems that we've talked about on this episode so far, right? Like creating these complicated contracts and getting the right review, making sure that it's the right language and it doesn't contradict or contravene anything inside of your company's legal position and playbooks, understanding what you've signed historically so you can make better informed decisions going forward, blah, 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 right? The challenge with that space and that category was always that in order to do all of that inside of your company, like let's say you're, a car manufacturer, you're like General Motors, and you're like, this sounds really, really important. We have a lot of contracts, especially if you think about GM, they have probably thousands of part suppliers, right? All over the globe. Everything from who builds your washer on your door all the way to like who does your paint supplies. And so your company like General Motors, you're like, this sounds great. I have the CLM thingy that I can deploy inside of my company, and it's going to radically improve our efficiency when it comes to dealing with contracts. We'll save all this time. We're going to avoid revenue leakage. Our legal teams are going to love it. The challenge has been, well, okay, that is usually like a 12 to 18th month massive project because you end up having to have really, really sophisticated experts come in, like SIs, and they would map out these exquisitely complicated workflows, and then they would go build that workflow. Literally, they would build that workflow using like business process management tools. And then anything that doesn't conform to the workflow just doesn't work. And so if users don't adopt to your workflow or adapt to your workflow, the workflow just dies on the vine. So you had both a complexity of modeling the business process, the rigidness of that business process modeled in your CLM software, and then you had an adoption challenge because again, if people don't conform to the workflow, the process, it breaks, right? It's kind of like going through TSA at the airport, right? You're like, ooh, I shouldn't have brought that 125 milliliters of water. And then you end up having to be the jerk who's like pouring the water out. And now all of a sudden the queue is backed up, right? It's like, so, with agents, you're kind of solving a lot of the same problems. It's the same, many of the same fundamental challenges, but it's just a much more organic, human-friendly way of doing it. And saying, you don't need to spend 12 months designing the perfect workflow. If the workflow has to change, people can do that using natural language. You can just talk to the tool and say, you know what, here's another version of this contract that they sent me over via email. Can you just attach it to the request and then parse out the differences and do the auto versioning and comparison? Like that is like incredibly powerful. So the ability to adapt the workflow in a more organic way to how people actually work in the real world, I think that's a radical change in what agents can help achieve. Now, there's also like, so that's one, I would say, more pragmatic interpretation of what agents can do. There's also the like flying cars version, which is, it's like, flying cars, and it can do everything on your behalf, and it'll automatically do all of the contracting work without humans involved, right? And obviously it's going to take us quite a while to get from, hey, agents are helping you just be able to do more and be more adaptable to how humans work, all the way to it's just going to do everything for you, right? There's a big kind of spectrum of outcomes in the middle.
And I guess like the way I'm hearing it, like once you map the processes, they kind of seem very rigid and deterministic. And like you find those like most rigid places which are like bound to break. And like that's the places where you can now put agents and then make workers kind of more flexible, I guess.
And in some industries, some domains, the predictability and rigidity of workflow is necessary, right? So to give you an example, like if you're helping kids open a new bank account, like let's say you're a bank, right? And one of your offerings is to help minors under the age of 18 be able to open a bank account. Well, what questions you ask them, what verifications you need, legal guardian consent, checks, like you want those to be pretty predictable, right? As a heavily regulated, exactly the outcome you want to get to, exactly the risks that you need to go assess. And so 95% of that process should be highly predictable, and it probably shouldn't vary all that much between your son Billy and your daughter Janie. Like You know what I mean? Now,
Yeah.
that being said, I said 95% because even in that scenario, there's 5% where agentic capabilities can still be truly, truly magical. And that's doing things like risk assessment. You may need to look at many, many different factors about your individual profile, how much information we can glean about you through other databases, social security, prior relationship with financial institutions, credit history, and then being able to come up with a more intelligent risk assessment and then deliver you a better experience. And maybe we need a little bit more information. Maybe you have to submit a pay stub from your summer job working at the amusement park, right? But I think this is also where agents can be incredibly valuable and help achieve better customer outcomes, but also better efficiency inside of the organization. And that's an example where you want it to be, again, 90 to 95% deterministic, repeatable, auditable. But that 5%, there's still room for AI and agents to come in and just take away some of the additional burden that otherwise a human would have had to manually review this particular application for Janie opening a bank account, or Shannon, I forget the name I use, but so even in some of these cases, so I think that there's always going to be room for agents to help. It just sort of dials up or dials down depending on the predictability needed in the process.
And when we look at the universal adoption curve, right? I think maybe a lot of people will know that, the S looking like as a letter S, the adoption curve, where it starts slow and then it picks up crazily and then, kind of fades out. Where do you believe we currently are, like, as a society within that adoption curve? Like, because right now, if you look on LinkedIn, everybody's adopting AI. Like, it's running companies, it's running departments. Like, it's crazy. But in reality, when you speak to the people like on the forefront of adopting these technologies, like, one, they all feel like everybody's behind. They're behind. Like, they can't keep up with the news, and we can't all be behind. Right.
Right. Well, it's funny. I spend a lot of time talking with we work with like Anthropic and NVIDIA and leading AI companies, and even they'll tell you like, oh, we feel like we got to go faster, right? And even they would acknowledge that it's actually too much, right? The pace of delivery and output and innovation is almost too much. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's just funny. It totally resonates, your point of like everyone feels like they're behind, but even the ones who are furthest ahead probably think that they have to just keep up. They have to keep up that velocity.
That's what's surprising me. And like even with Anthropic's, I think, article yesterday, they came out as like, guys, we need to stop the innovation,
right?
And
right.
Then you let the world kind of adopt what is already here, because it's gonna take time. And what are you seeing, like, in terms of, I know on an individual level, it's easy. You have your own like local setup, you're playing around, and that's kind of easy to adopt. But then when it comes to adopting them within companies, then you have like legal compliance and like actual people using that. How are you seeing that kind of level of adoption? And how do you personally, like, as a product manager, kind of try to push these companies to adopt and take those leaps to try the technology, start trusting it? How are you seeing the industry?
I think what's happening here is that every company that serves a very large customer base of organizations and enterprises like we do is going to face the same interesting dynamic of like, there's an innovation frontier that's moving at 120 miles an hour. And then there's the tail edge of that is moving at like 5 miles an hour, because those are your biggest, most entrenched, typically most regulated industry verticals, right? So you think healthcare, financial services, insurance, real estate, manufacturing, construction. But that's where most of the real world lives. And I think that it's easy for many of us who are on the bleeding edge, whether you're at a software company, you're at an AI company, you're at a startup, you're on the bleeding edge and you forget you're very much in a bubble, right, of innovation. Whereas the rest of the world is struggling to keep up. And I think that being at a company like DocuSign, where we have such a wildly diverse set of customers, right? And some of these are mom and pop shops who are like, look, I just really need to get this thing signed. I don't have, like, they're not interested in the latest, all of the buzz, hype worthy kind of AI. And so where does that mean in terms of where we are in the journey? I think it means that obviously I think if there's one thing we can all agree on, because nobody has a crystal ball, it's that the effects of all of this innovation, whether it's AI, whether it's agents, has on this, let's call it the 95th percentile, like human being, I
Yeah.
think is still incredibly early.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the same kind of notion that I'm getting from like everybody that I speak to. They're like, we're at the
Yeah.
very, very beginning. Well, at
Yeah.
the same time, you look at shareholders, you look at like C-level executive, and they're like, we need to push for AI everywhere.
Yeah.
But then when you actually speak to the people in the industry, like everybody's being fairly careful and like just starting to like drive first steps in adopting all of those technologies. And as a final question, I want to know, what are you most excited about when it comes to like seeing the DocuSign within the next 2-3 years on the personal
Yeah.
level and on the professional level?
That's a really good question. I think that there's still, again, going back to that analogy of kind of these, the fast frontier and sort of the slow one. I think that there's still so much economic and human opportunity and value to the average person, the average business. Just the next time you sign an offer letter or buy a house or lease an apartment or give consent or sign up, you're, I don't know, getting orthodontics done. Just like, anywhere in your life where contracts like agreements show up, take notice of still how lousy that workflow probably is. And
100%.
I think it shows, and it's sort of directly correlated with the size of the organization. Like the more it's like a mom and pop shop businesses, but they still have to have the same, like if you're going to get your car fixed, there's very specific state requirements on your right to accept the quote or shop it around. So there's all these regulations around how that relationship is governed between you and the auto body shop, and so they have to go do things a certain way. That doesn't mean that they're going to give you a great experience, right? They're going to send you a really crappy PDF. You're going to have to fill it out. You have to refill it out probably 3 times, and then you have to pay your deposit, and that's using a different tool over here. So these moments in life that I think revolve around agreements that I think are still so much opportunity. And we talk about AI and agents and all this like Star Trek stuff, but just basic moments in life that I think are still far from being done ideal. I think that's what I'm still excited about. And I think that's where the pragmatic part of me with AI is, how do you help customers, these business organizations, especially the SMBs and mom and pop shops? I think they're largely feeling like the technology is probably leaving them behind. They're like, this is great stuff, but I got to run a business. And you know what? My CRM that I use to deal with my auto body customers is still running on Windows like XP,
95.
right? Right. And so how do you bring them along? I mean, that's I think that's the real challenge, societal challenge.
Well, I'm really excited to see the role DocuSign is going to be playing once we actually hit, on the bell curve, we actually hit the mass adoption level. I think that's going to be the very interesting time to get there. Until there, thank you so much for joining the show. Thank you so much for sharing
Absolutely.
all of the cutting edge that you've been doing personally. And actually, like you're like the way you're explaining things, I think you would be a really good teacher, like in terms of like helping people understand with
Well,
given
thank you.
examples. And I think that's going to be really valuable for our listeners as well. And I'll make
Well, if
sure
all this
to
product
include
stuff doesn't work out, then I know I got a career ahead of me. So at least I'll hopefully can find a job somewhere.
whatever AI does, we'll always find something. Thanks so much for coming to the show. It's been a real pleasure. And I'll make sure to drop you a message once we start doing episodes around product management, because that's something that apparently all of us will have to become fantastic at. Thanks so much,
Yeah,
Larry.
yeah, and I'm looking forward to that. I think that'll be a really good series. I think that'll be an interesting one too, because like you said, more and more jobs within traditional functions are probably going to start feeling product management esque.
Mhm.
And then I think people who traditionally consider themselves product managers at the same time also have to evolve. So it's kind of, yeah, it's really interesting. I think the next 3 to 5 years, we're probably going to see some pretty major transformation and maybe convergence. Yeah, I don't know. I'm like you said, we should probably have you have a whole podcast series on this topic alone.
I have a lot of questions in my mind right now, but I know we have to stop because I know your time is quite packed as well. Thanks so much for coming to the show. Let's talk again.
Thanks for having me.